are dying.
Retrofitting homes. Prime source heat pumps.
Because I don't have a future.
Hello and welcome to the Climate Week Climate Debates live stream. It's Thursday, the 10th of August 2023, and it's still global boiling. This week we have a great guest, and I'm joined in the studio by Ed Rennie, of course, co-founder of Climate Debate. But first, we're going to have a look at the recent news, and then after the live stream again we're going to be having a Twitter Spaces discussion on the subject of whether popular opinion can change climate politics. A very lively topic with opinions going back and forward across the political divide at the moment. People one moment saying they're for net zero and the next against, it seems. And this is especially pertinent as our guest tonight is something of a Westminster insider. So we'll be able to hopefully have that discussion with the benefit of our guest's insights. So what's been happening in the world? As the heat wave dissipated and the smoke from the wildfires cleared, the Met Office has issued, or did issue earlier in the week or last week, a danger to life warning because of Storm Antony hitting the West Coast. Rather a ridiculous warning on any measure, as if people didn't know how to cope with rain and wind. But that's possibly not quite as disappointing as the barbecue summer we have had and the turnaround of the new IPCC chair, Jim McSweeney, who we reported last week had poured some cold water on Antonio Guterres' claims about this being the era of global boiling. Jim McSweeney had said that 1.5 degrees of warming is not the end of the world, and sort of said we should be a bit more grown up about it. But this week he had an interview with the Evening Standard where he seems to have changed his mind, telling the Evening Standard that global warming may be happening faster than expected. Expected by whom and how fast exactly that was, it's not really sure. Things always seem to be worse than had been previously anticipated, but then things never seem to be quite as bad as people said they were going to be 20 years ago, 10 years ago. So who knows what Jim McSweeney is on about. And it's quite likely, I think, that he has been lent on from above. And it does seem to be that the UN are getting ever more desperate, as this missive shows. This is the United Nations Environment Programme's tweet. It says, the effects of climate change are already visible and will be catastrophic unless we take urgent action. And this is an undeniable threat. Now, I want to challenge that word undeniable. Does that mean you're not allowed to deny it, or does it mean that it's true, an unimpeachable truth? I think we really need to reflect on that and why it is that the United Nations is so keen for us to think in this way and to be this terrified of climate change. because it does seem to be an extremely powerful global political agency with the weakest claim to democratic legitimacy and the highest claims to absolute moral virtue, I think we need to be careful of it. One reason we may, behind their increasing desperation, may be the weakening of the economic case for climate change, as is evidenced by the falling apart of the ESG agenda, not least, of course, domestically. We've had Nigel Farage doing a good job of shining a light on ESG after refusing to be one of its victims. But it seems to be Standard & Poor, the ratings agency in the US, which this week has decided that there is something irrational at the heart of ESG ratings that is irreconcilable against reality. Some are trying to frame this as conservative attacks, Republican attacks, but it seems much more likely that it is reality that is imposing itself on the schemes of the world's wealthiest scammers, if I can put it so bluntly. And in Britain too, not far behind the scammers of Wall Street are the scaremongers of Whitehall. The deputy PM this week has released the new government's risk register. Well, the government's new risk register. This is apparently a list of things which we need to be very, very frightened about. And here is Oliver Dowden, the man responsible for this register, apparently. And what he's highlighted is the Russia-Ukraine war, COVID, and climate change. Now, whatever position you take on those biggest risks that we face, in fact, it's the government often that makes the worst decisions about those things, amplifying any extant risks that they have. Let's just not get into the weeds on Russia at the moment, but the COVID-19 pandemic, I think most people would agree, has been terribly mismanaged rather than the risks mitigated. And that's a subject that we're going to be discussing probably for the next few decades. The risk register compiles all of the items in the register in a matrix, which you probably can't see the detail of on the screen, but on the left, running up to the top, are risks running minor, limited, moderate, significant, and catastrophic impacts. And on the bottom, from 1 to 5, are the likelihood: less than 0.2, 0.2 to 1%, 1% to 5%, 5% to 25%, and greater than 25%. Now, all of those green items that I've circled, these are natural and environmental hazards, such as wildfires, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and severe space weather, storms. And what's telling, I think, is that I've also circled number 26, which is a catastrophic risk with a chance of happening of between 1 and 5%. I think that's a year, but it may be a different frequency. And 26, or 26A, in fact, is the failure of the National Electricity Transmission System. Now, notice that no green item that's ringed is a greater risk than the catastrophic risk of the failure of our power system. So why on earth would we sacrifice the security of our power system for the sake of securing ourselves against the green items? I'm sure we'll learn more about that later on. The government this week, also published some estimates of future energy generation costs or power costs. The Department for Energy Security and Net Zero has declared that gas is going to be more expensive than wind. However, many critics are calling this crystal bollocks. Projects commissioned in 2025 are missing the estimates of offshore and onshore wind and large-scale solar point out the critics are missing cost estimates of the backup costs, balancing and constraint payments, grid integration and expansion costs, and they are based on fairy tale lifespans and load factors. And if you look at the price of gas, that's made double the price of wind by a carbon tax. 52% of the cost is going to be carbon. And we also might want to look at the green section there, which is the cost of the fuel. But what if we didn't arbitrarily tax carbon in this way? And what if we developed natural gas production properly, such as America has done, to half or more than half the cost of gas in this country? We might end up with something far, far cheaper. Ed, could you keep an eye on the comments? Cheers. Yeah, so it's no use blaming Putin or external factors for the rising cost of this fuel. These are all the direct consequences of policy decisions. And we should thank Steve Loftus for that chart, which and the notes on that chart, which I've adapted. These figures are high because the department's staffers know that the levelized cost of energy estimates that they're all based on are going to be rejected. And the actual costs of wind energy, I'm sure we'll have been more about it in a bit, are well in excess of £100 a megawatt hour. But these predictions for 2025 assume a radical reduction. No wind farms are producing power at these prices, despite claims from green organisations like Carbon Brief. Lord Frost has weighed in through the Net Zero Watch, calling pretty upfront about Whitehall's obfuscation about the true costs of wind power. And Andrew Montfort of Net Zero Watch put it pretty strongly too, saying that people are calling these figures lies, which they do seem to be. And this is the tipping point Andrew Montfort makes in his comments. He was referring to. This is the Guardian begging on behalf of big wind. Big wind still cannot stand on its own 2 feet, even after 20 years of subsidy regimes. Also, David Turver, you need to go and have a read of his articles on this subject. His analysis suggests that the costs are going to be in the order of £131 a megawatt hour. So really do go and look out for David Turver's analysis and Net Zero Watches and Andrew Montford's. These are really essential for understanding the debate as it's moving on at the moment. These are important arguments. Another news, the public, following on from last week's revelation that people in a poll are not willing to pay for net zero, even if they support it. Public support for green policies like the abolition of petrol and diesel cars is dropping, even though it seems that maybe banning the installation of gas boilers for some reason is becoming more popular. Other policies are becoming significantly less popular. And this is, of course, carrying on having an effect on the government and co. Priti Patel, formerly of the government, says it's time for this country's hardworking silent majority to take back control of the green agenda. Now, I think that's okay, and we should welcome this, more joy in heaven and all that. But what politicians really need to do is to fess up to how their own parties have put the green blob before the public in the past. This has been going on. The Tory government is 13 years old, and there's a lot of explaining to do. It's not good enough to just blame Labour. Finally, then, Keir Starmer is flip-flopping with the climate zombies. The FT reports that Starmer is considering some net zero skepticism, in particular opposing ULEZ policies outside of London, probably having given in to Sadiq Khan. But in the FT, Sorry, no, in the Sunday Times, uh, he reiterates his commitment to net zero, and despite saying he's not an ideological zealot for or against net zero, like GSO, he wants to make Britain a clean energy superpower by 2030. Right. Well, I'm joined in the studio, of course, as ever, by a slightly sunburned Ed Rennie, co-founder of Climate Debate. So, why, why net zero at all? Why be a clean energy superpower at all? And why by 2030 and not 2035 or 2040? What's Starmer up to, Ed?
Well, in one sense, Starmer is actually a fairly inexperienced politician. He doesn't really know what he was doing. He was only elected to Parliament very recently, the same time as Rishi Sunak, as it happens, who was also a very inexperienced politician. And but it's not just that, because obviously some very experienced politicians go along with this same way of thinking. But the key move here is because the government has moved on new oil and gas licenses. Keir Starmer thinks, well, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to appeal to those Times-reading middle classes who quite like the idea of being green and net zero is part of that. So he's going to make an appeal to them. So his thinking, strategic thinking, informed by the kind of classic Blairite political thinkers in his back room, will be, well, the Tories have moved off to the right here. It's a chance for us to move into the centre. And although, you know, for some like us, reading his article, it seems actually very ideological, despite his denial. For many, that will be read as pragmatic and as holding firm on the net zero agenda. And of course, they perceive that as pragmatic as well. So that's his appeal. What does have to be kept in mind, though, is that there is a genuine pragmatism that's a section of what he has said, not in this article, is that when this government grants new oil and gas licenses, the incoming Labour government, if that happens, he's committed to not reversing them. Now, that's probably I don't think you can trust many things that Keir Starmer said, but I think that is probably actually true. But it also kind of slightly belies his kind of green virtue signaling in this sense, in that, well, actually, everything that the government does to grant oil and gas licenses between now and the general election, he is committed to letting those go ahead for pragmatic business reasons. You know, you can't give business the green light to do something and then turn it off again.
That's really upset the Green Party, and they're saying, well, where's the opposition? Keir Starmer confirmed Labour won't revoke oil and gas licenses issued by the Conservatives, as if they could without causing chaos. But of course, they were happy with the cross-party consensus on climate change until now. So now that there seems to be a sort of consensus of dithering on both sides, of uncertainty on side, they're a bit more upset. But do you I mean, we're going to talk about this, of course, later on, but briefly, do you think there's a possibility of opposition to net zero emerging in Parliament?
Well, it's there in Parliament already. It's not very vocal, but there are MPs, particularly in red wall seats, who see this as problematic. I think at the moment on the Tory benches, I think you'll find that the most sceptical views will say that, look, 2050 is fine. It just can't be all these madcap things like banning sale of gas boilers, banning internal combustion engine cars, and all these very restrictive moves, and ULEZ and whatever else. But this will arise, I think, when the political pressure arises, and how that comes about is a matter for debate. I know Pete North has been tweeting about this. I have my own thoughts about that. But the question is the political pressure will come if these policies are about to go ahead or are imposed, and then you will see the backlash, and that will move things. The question is, can things move before then? And we've seen them moved a little bit as it becomes clearer that when actual votes are counted, in practice, much of these net zero policies are very unpopular, and of course, as we know from David Payton and many others, are actually not very good at achieving their stated aim.
Right. There's another problem haunting Westminster, and particularly Starmer at the moment. One of Labour's candidates for the next election, it seems to be something of a Greenpeace activist. Alistair Strathern is his name. He's a Labour candidate from somewhere in London. There's a little video of him. We haven't had much luck with videos in the past. Let's see if this plays. It's quite funny. We don't need the sound, so I'm not sure which the guy is. I think it's the guy on the left, behind the woman with the Greenpeace red shirt. I think that's him. There is probably his fingers. This is a typical kind of Greenpeace stunt. I think that's him too. So yeah, a fairly typical Greenpeace stunt. Apparently, Stratton is a long-term partner of a political officer for Greenpeace, according to Guido Fawkes, who also, that's the way the video is from. They were objecting to the government's Public Order Act in 2022. And here he is. Now, I think more interesting than him being a Labour councillor and parliamentary candidate is he works for the bloody Bank of England. Now, I've often joked that the Bank of England's web pages on climate risk might just as well have been written by Greenpeace, and I thought I was joking, but it's true. That's exactly what's going on. Anyhow, there are, I would say, more vampire than zombie. The Tories have got their own version of that problem. But their solution might be to send their eco-vampires and eco-zombies to the Labour Party. But this isn't just a Labour problem, is it? I mean, it's kind of related to the question before, but how can parties get rid of these eco-zombies and the such like? Can they chuck them out? Can they get some garlic going on? Is there a climate garlic? Ed?
Well, I mean, the thing about Zach is that some of the vitriol that so many of the Labour Party have had towards him means that, I mean, obviously he can vote for whoever he likes. If he wants to vote Labour at the next general election, then there's not much Labour the party can do about it. But the idea that they would welcome him as a member of the Labour Party, I think, is just for the birds, really, because he's for non-green reasons. Obviously, they don't have any objection to his green zealotry, as it were, but they just won't have him for other reasons, given the things that they've thrown at him and some of the tactics during that when he stood against Sadiq Khan for the mayoralty of London. It rather reminds us of the similarity between the two. I mean, imagine ULEZ and everything else would be just as bad, if not worse, with him as mayor of London, although he was never going to win. But yeah, it's just that it's this perennial problem that both the main parties have, and I don't think they see it sufficiently as a problem yet to want to get rid of these people. And certainly, the Tory party, I don't think, wants to get rid of Zach Goldsmith. I mean, he's very, very personable and likable in person, unlike many politicians. But no, the Labour will probably not see this as a problem. I think it is a problem for them, but I don't think they yet have grasped how unpopular this green zealotry is going to be for them.
Yeah, well, Therese Coffey has a bit of a solution. She's chucked Greenpeace out of DEFRA, but I wondered what were they ever doing there in the first place. And it really does seem to be that the whole place is overrun with eco-zombies. Not just the parties, the whole place, the whole of Westminster. Speaking of which then, Ed, do you want to introduce tonight's guest?
Absolutely. So tonight we are joined by James McSweeney, who will be known to people on Twitter as Westminster Pup. James is a very effective policy analyst based in Westminster, and we're very fortunate to have him with us this evening. And he's a great writer, and being fairly, shall we say, irreverent of the political class, Ed Miliband most recently in particular, but also kind of giving us the history of our recent energy policy and why it's been so rubbish and short-sighted. But yeah, we're very glad to have you on tonight. Thanks for joining us, James.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So really, I just wanted to start with a kind of very broad question for you. I usually don't like hypothetical questions, but I think this one will be quite instructive, because a lot of your recent work has, as I say, been kind of deconstructing energy policy as it stands from both recent governments and prospective Labour governments. But if I could momentarily get you to imagine that you have the power of the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the Energy Minister, and you have the civil service at your command, and you don't have any lawfare issues to block you, what would be our ideal UK-based energy policy starting this autumn and going up until 2035 towards 2050, regardless of any net zero aims, just purely on what we need in terms of energy? And, you know, does small nuclear reactors and shale gas come into your kind of ideal energy policy for the UK?
Sure. So a good place to start to stop weird regressive information feedback loops kind of proliferating through the energy department, which seems to be what's happening now, is to revoke elements of the Climate Change Act, which put us on course to meet net zero as a legal obligation. Something I've gone into is it seems to be the case that because civil servants feel the need that they have to hit targets and they can't really do it, they end up kind of fudging figures. And then ministers make decisions based on fudged figures, and that requires figures to be fudged even more, and then we get into kind of a lot of trouble. So revoke that first. That will make everything go more smoothly. Secondly, because we're hitting a supply crunch. So dispatchable supply, that is supply that can be generated on demand, is already below peak demand, which means that if we don't have wind at the right moment, then if we were unlucky, there would be a full-scale blackout, which would obviously be quite devastating. So we need to pay really what we can to keep what is still running, what's due to shut down, ticking over. And that means delaying gas station closures, trying to get coal stations back online, delaying nuclear closures can be done. They can actually, it's kind of turned out in the last few years, those things can run a lot longer than we thought they could. So that's the security first. You have to get security first. And then when it comes to what you do moving forward, I think it's quite clear that CCGTs, that's combined cycle gas turbines, are going to remain competitive. They're somewhat quicker to build than nuclear power stations, and obviously you can vary output, so push forward for those. And then if you want to move towards a clean solution, and also hypothetically a cheaper solution in the long run, and one which keeps you insulated from shocks like we've seen over the last couple of years, really go hard on nuclear energy. And the thing with nuclear energy is the price is so sensitive to discount rates, so effectively to interest rates, and to the time it takes you to build them. So what you'd have to do is you'd have to cut. We have one of the worst regulators in the world for this, and it's even worse than the US NRC. And in combination with community consultations, climate assessments, all of the malarkey in our planning system. It really drags out the construction of nuclear power plants. When we had one in Wales, basically paused and go bankrupt because of a local tern colony. So you'd have to create special planning orders for our existing established nuclear sites and just get building really immediately. The Chinese can actually build nuclear power stations in 4.5 years. I don't think we could do that immediately because we don't really have the expertise in the country. But once you started going, you could do it pretty quickly. The French, over the course of 15 years, from 1974, managed to build 56 nuclear reactors and just went from below 10% nuclear power to approaching 90%. They almost went net zero. They could have, they weren't aiming to, they just wanted energy security. But the French effectively did net zero from the 70s to the 90s, got really secure power supply, really cheap power. They're now having some of the cheapest power in Europe, basically because of this policy, which involved basically bypassing planning rules. So it can be done. So that would be my medium-term strategy. Go hard for nuclear. You mentioned SMRs. Not so convinced that they make sense in the UK context. Not particularly. I was talking to an engineer earlier who, I don't want to get in trouble, but wasn't particularly enthusiastic about Rolls-Royce's proposed design. A system with as much projected demand as the UK should really makes more sense. And when we have established sites already in an established distribution network, it really makes more sense to go for larger ones, I think. But I'm open to counter arguments on that. So yeah, that would be my my plan. Repeal Climate Change Act, go for CCGTs. Well, keep everything running that is running. Go for CCGTs, and then push through some planning reform to get nuclear off the ground really quickly.
Okay, so in terms of a follow-up question to that is, and you've already obviously written this at great length, I mean, are we still going in the wrong direction despite the recent move by the government to go ahead with more oil and gas licenses? I mean, where are we now in terms of the direction? Obviously there would have to be a big step change to go to what you've just outlined. But I mean, are we still sort of heading more or less in the wrong direction with pursuing, the latest thing is to bring in onshore wind power and this reliance on this very unreliable energy source, never mind solar power in this country. It feels like despite these recent licenses going ahead from the government, we're still actually overall headed in the wrong direction rather than sort of turning it around.
Yeah, so the new gas licenses aren't going to make a huge difference is what the feedback I've been getting from industry people, just because, I mean, we could expand our reserves. There is still a lot of oil and gas in the North Sea, but the current tax system is so uncompetitive. No one's really interested in doing it. We've had major pipelines announcing they're going to shut down, which is going to cause a lot of chaos. That doesn't really affect things on the actual electricity generation side, really, unless there's a critical global shortage. We are rich enough that we will buy supplies at whatever price. In terms of unreliable power supplies, yeah, we are in this kind of place now where there's been a lot of wishful thinking happening at National Grid and in government. They have this, I think someone just mentioned it in the comments, but we have this idea of demand side response. So the UK has a capacity market, which is meant to prevent blackouts. So you have renewables, because they turn on and off. They push out reliable generators at the margins, because if they have to turn on and off as well because the wind keeps coming, they become unprofitable. So we have a capacity market to keep them in, hypothetically, in theory, to stop blackouts. But what we've started doing recently is, instead of purchasing more dispatchable power, we've been purchasing dispatchable demand, which means that people at the National Grid think that they can just turn demand on and off, which is all well and good. They've run some tests. I suspect they will find that in midwinter, when people are using heat pumps, demand becomes quite inelastic, so to speak. You're not going to turn off your heating if it's cold when you're approaching peak demand. And the more people have heat pumps, the less flexible demand's going to be. Also, demand side response is just a value shredding operation anyway, because I mean, electricity is a service. It's not really a commodity. It's valuable because you have it when you want it. So I mean, it's kind of backwards economics, but that's what they're doing. Another thing they're doing is sort of purchasing capacities. They've been purchasing interconnector capacity, which is the idea which a lot of countries have had, which is that if you don't build domestic generation, but you do build interconnectors with other countries, you can feed off their generation without it counting towards your domestic CO2 emissions, which is great until more than one person has the same plan, which is what happened this March, where we were like to the French, hey, can we have some energy? And they were like, oh, we were about to ask you the same question. Both systems almost tripped out, and it was only saved by a coal station, which is now shut down. So yeah, in response, we are in a pretty precarious situation. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's I mean, so a lot of the I mean, if we'll put it this way, a lot of the MPs that I speak to who are kind of more on the skeptical end of the whole net zero agenda, they often put it in these terms, in kind of succinct terms of gas to nuclear, and that being the way. Because I mentioned shale gas before. I mean, is that a trickier one because simply Ed Davey brought in those regulations that meant we can't even find out whether we've got any. But it would gas to nuclear be a kind of broad kind of answer to what, if you want to give people a snap answer? I mean, does that kind of fit the bill, or is there just some additional undeniable complexity with other things like coal and whatnot that you have to throw in as well?
The advantage to having coal in your system is that you have that, having a mixed system gives you a degree of insulation. The advantage we had of phasing out coal, the advantage we were going to have, this is why the CCGTs were brought in the first place, is without coal, gas no longer serves as a peaker. It can run more consistently. If you can run CCGTs consistently, they become a lot cheaper because their thermal efficiency gets above 60%. That's to turn it on and off, it goes down to 40%. So CCGTs should have become cheaper over the last 10 years, but because as we phased out coal, we phased in wind, which goes on and off. They've been turning on and off the whole time. Their average electricity price has been like 60% above the European average. The European Commission did a study into this a couple of years ago, and they concluded our gas-fired electricity is so expensive because we keep turning them on and off again, basically. Yes, that's not really answered your question. There is an advantage to having some coal capacity because it can insulate you from shocks, which is what everyone in Europe has been doing. Gas, in theory, can work quite well. I mean, if you look at the United States, they have much cheaper electricity than us because they don't put anywhere near the carbon tax on their electricity, like way, way cheaper, like really internationally competitive, and it's very heavily dependent on gas. And the gas-dependent states have been having like cheaper than the more renewable dependent ones. So yeah, there is a viable future for gas. If you want more support for gas, then getting drilling and getting some domestic production will obviously boost that, because even if the price goes up, I mean, that just, you do in Norway basically, and the government and communities kind of rake in the cash based on that price rise, and it kind of like mitigates public disquiet about gas prices to some extent. One of the clever tricks of green advocates is to block any attempt at domestic gas production, and then claim that we need to move to renewables so we don't become dependent on imports, which is just fascinating. Clever tactic, basically. So yeah, domestic gas production would, I guess, maybe help shore up consent for more gas generation. Having some backup coal has some merit to it, just so you can kind of do what Germany's been doing. Sadly, whilst other European countries have been shutting down their coal, mothballing their coal stations, we, I think for, cinematic reasons, have been blowing ours up when we shut them down because it looks cool and it's a sign of progress, etc. So then when everyone else had that panic last year and they all turned their gas stations back on, we were left looking like fools, unable to well, just sifting through the rubble of ours. So yeah, gas backup's good. Coal backup's good. Gas is a good mainstay, I think, for now, just because nuclear is going to take a while to like figure out. But yeah, gas to nuclear, I agree. In short.
Yes. Okay. And I mean, you mentioned briefly the carbon taxes there. I mean, this is a pretty significant. It's the windfall taxes on the oil companies, and the carbon taxes on any fuel that comes to us from hydrocarbons. So I mean, those tax overall must surely, that would have to shift in a major way to get the kind of development that we would need over the next 30 years. I mean, you know, before you can get those nuclear power stations that you need.
Carbon tax on electricity generation, you mean?
Well, no, but it seems to me the entire tax system is very much sort of rigged towards making the kind of outline, you know, proposals that you started with. It seems that would just make the whole tax system in general, windfall taxes, carbon taxes, you name it, the whole thing seems to be holding that back as well. You know, and maybe generating revenue, but also creating, you know, making price inflation worse and everything into the mix.
Yes. So, I mean, yeah, if you want domestic oil and gas production, you would alter the taxing system there. I mean, it's arbitrary, and it's depleting our reserves. Yeah, on domestic generation right now, carbon taxes, emissions trading scheme, it adds about £87 to a household bill. It's rising. If you look at the Energy Department's projections for 2025, which came out last week, they really wanted to make wind look cheaper than gas, but they couldn't quite do it. So they assumed operation and maintenance costs for wind would just drop by 75%, which is hilarious. But they still looked kind of even. So they're like, what can we do here? All right, we'll just throw a more than 100% carbon tax on the price of gas, and then we can say gas is twice as expensive as wind generation, which is a neat trick. But the trick is to increase the price of gas, hope people don't really notice why, and then say wind eventually is cheaper, or wind is predicted to be cheaper. And I think that's one of the reasons people aren't going to activate contracts for difference, which are the strike prices for wind, for people who don't know, new wind generation. They're not going to activate them at these prices, and they wouldn't even if they could, because the price of gas is going to keep going up. It's going to probably be at £70 a megawatt hour soon. Why would you take a £50 a megawatt hour contract if gas, which sets the market price, is going to keep rising? You're not going to. Yeah, carbon taxes are going to become an increasingly pertinent political issue, and people are starting to notice what they're actually doing to their household bills.
Yes. No, I mean, it seems to me, I mean, it's a worthwhile question, because I have this in my mind all the time, and viewers should just know Ben's keen to ask you questions as well, but he's having problems with his internet connection, so we'll just let the viewers know that. But it seems to me, I mean, there's a question about to what extent, you know, this is, you know, it seems to me that there has to be a change in political will to begin to get the shifts we need, because I wonder how much, from your perspective, is it being held in place by the political power of what you might call the technocracy, or you know, the kind of the behind the scenes aspect of the blob and the civil service. And, you know, could you get a situation where, frankly, large parts of Parliament and the politicians were actually saying, look, this is ridiculous. Whoever pursues these policies gets punished in opinion polls. What is your sense of how much of the civil service would hold that back, or are they actually fed up with fudging statistics and making things seem so that aren't based on reality?
Well, a lot of them don't actually really know what they're doing. They're not like some people are, but a lot of people genuinely believe this stuff, which is weird. I mean, clearly the people actually doing the fudging what they're doing and ought to be fired. But a lot of people in institutions kind of believe what they're doing. If they fudge things a bit, they think it's for the right cause, and they don't realize everyone else is doing the same thing, which cumulatively creates a much bigger lie than they are personally responsible for. In terms of why politicians go along with it, there seem to be different categories here. I mean, why is there not a big nuclear lobby in Westminster? Well, it's because there are only like 6 approved nuclear sites in the UK. It's a small amount of constituencies. They're not always popular. They are actually popular in communities that have been around them for a while, but it's just not a big constituency. You're not going to get a lot of lobbying done. It's not going to benefit a lot of people. It'll benefit the country eventually, but it's not exciting for MPs. Why is there a big wind lobby? Because you can distribute projects everywhere. You have, these carbon capture storage projects are being just kind of like awarded like political trophies to strategic constituencies, areas we want to level up and stuff. Very expensive technology, complete nonsense as an idea. Carbon capture storage would require us to, I think, just to capture what our gas plants produce now, it would be like somewhere in the range of 60 million metric tons of CO2 a year, which is more than 150% what the gas we take out of the oil we take out of the North Sea, and then stuff it underground and hope it doesn't leak, because that would kill a load of people. So it's like a really bad idea, really expensive, can only be more expensive than what we're doing now. Would require massive infrastructure investment. Not a great idea, but very easy to lobby for, because people want these pipeline projects. People want facilities in their constituencies. You can distribute them. Same with wind. You can promise like benefits to locals. You can promise manufacturing jobs. Really easy projects to lobby for. And then there's such a variety of green projects that a lot of people feel personally connected to the green agenda. When we looked at the estimates debate recently on the infrastructure spend projections of the government for net zero, I was expecting a lot of hostility, but dozens of even Conservative MPs turned up to say how great this was for their constituency because they bring jobs in. So almost a bit of a crisis of the commons here. Everyone thinks a critical mass of MPs who make up a large percentage of those who are interested have something to gain. And then you have something which is slightly more insidious, which is you have some people, I don't want to make direct accusations because I don't want to get in serious trouble, but there are some people who seem to take up relatively well remunerated positions after they make decisions in politics. For example, not making any allegations. Chris Goodmore authors the net zero review for the government, recommends carbon capture storage. A few months later, he's being paid 80 grand by a carbon capture storage company. Chris Huhne changed the subsidy regime to benefit biomass generation, a form of generation which involves cutting down trees. It has a worse carbon footprint than coal. And if you combine it with carbon capture storage, it's actually an energy sink. Like it wastes more energy than it produces, exceedingly expensive, billions in subsidies. And what did he do once he quit office and served his jail sentence? Well, he took a director role on a biomass company. So there is a little bit of something going on there. And if you look at people in the CCC, a number of them are invested in renewable companies. Not saying that's their primary motivation, but it does happen. So there is a situation here where most MPs deal with too many things to be, aware of the technicalities of the electric grid. And it's not their fault. They're just like very busy. And of those who care, disproportionate amount care because they have an incentive, because they think it's good for their constituency. So it creates quite a toxic network. So you'd have to have a very loud public backlash felt at elections for anything to change, I think.
Yes. Well, we've been returned. We have the return of our host, Ben. So, Ben, you definitely had some questions, I'm sure, for James.
Yeah, I did. Unfortunately, I think the people behind the wind farm developments are behind my ISP. And I wouldn't trust anyone with the name 3 again to provide my internet. Anyway, so I haven't heard any of your discussion, unfortunately. So I may be asking a question Ed's asked, but what I'm really interested in is from our point of view, or from an outsider's point of view, when I see politicians, some of whom I know them quite well in terms of their public shows, and is it intransigence or cognitive dissonance that we're dealing with? Well, you know, we don't know. Well, that's what it looks like to us. It's got to be one of these two things, right? So you must have gone in and pretty green, as it were. What woke you up to the problem? If this isn't the question that Ed has already asked you, what all this is? Did you sort of go into work one day thinking that you might be saving the planet, but then the next a bit more skeptical by virtue of what you'd seen?
So I looked at the capacity estimates, and I saw that the dispatchable capacity, I put them out in a different spreadsheet and tallied the dispatchable generation. Noticed it was going down. Then I looked at projections of peak demand and realized it was going up and was crossing that year, which was a couple of years ago. And I was like, well, that seems like a major cock up. How interesting. I must be getting something wrong, because surely there are loads of very intelligent people involved in this who would spot that, because it's like the most fundamental thing about a grid, that dispatchable capacity has to meet peak demand. It's like grids 101. So I asked around. I asked someone who's a junior minister in the department, because I was concerned. They just thought it was a fun fact. They thought it was funny. They made a joke about the civil service, and then they moved on. And I was like, okay, well, he doesn't take it seriously. And then I asked around more, and I looked at what the National Grid ESO was saying, and they I can't remember which position holder it was, but they did something on how the grid would be fine because people would reverse charge their electric cars back into the grid when needed. And then I looked at their own assessments, and they said that the chances of this being people consenting to this because it would burn up your battery on a large scale were very low. And it's like, okay, well, they're not taking it seriously because they've just contradicted their own assessment. And the further and further I went into it, I realized that everyone was either deliberately lying or living in a fairy tale. And I became increasingly concerned. And I gave it a year for someone to convince me otherwise, and I decided to write about it because it struck me that there was some kind of very strange collective delusion going on. And in answer to your question, like what motivates these people, I just went through some of the kind of electoral and allegedly something else motivations. Another one is like people, like MPs live in London. Everyone in London who controls anything, effectively, they go to the same social clubs, they socialize in the same circles. And being part of that culture, it can be a bit intoxicating. It's a great way to get jobs, and MPs don't have particularly secure or that well paid, to be honest, jobs, given their insecurity. And so they want to be part of that world. They want to mix into that world. It is socially seductive. I call them the please invite me to dinner brigade. And it also has potentially a potential financial payoff. So they adopt the mores of elite London circles in media and business because they want to be invited to dinner. And unless they have a big incentive not to, they go along with it. There was an interesting poll last year on the opinions of MPs versus their voters. Conservative MPs are like on social issues, they're like to the left of your average voter. They're about in line with your average Labour voter. They're way to the left of swing voters. And I think part of that is just wanting to be part of things. If it's a high status opinion, unless they have a good reason not to mimic it, they're just going to mimic it, which is a perfectly understandable human instinct. But yeah,
So this is more a political culture as such rather than ideology as such. Like like it's more it's not as concrete as an ideology as it's more people just monkey see, monkey do. And sort of some level of intransigence is built into that culture, rather than and no one really daring to challenge the ideology of it consciously. Is that?
Yeah, like most people aren't ideological. I mean, you can't, like most people aren't going to think through all of their opinions at a very
you'd
deep
expect
level.
people in Westminster to be a little bit more reflective on ideology than sort of like, you know, someone the high street or, you know, football match.
Well,
I don't know, whatever.
Well, sure, but like there are a lot of topics out there, right? They're very, very busy, and you know, if impressive sounding people around you are reassuring you of something, and you don't necessarily have a reason to challenge them, you're just going to take their word for it. And if taking their word for it has a massive social payoff and a potential financial payoff, you definitely don't have an incentive to challenge them.
That's an interesting point, and that's quite valuable from the point of an outsider. It's something we hadn't really sort of thought much about. So when the Climate Change Act, well, the bill was being read, the chair of the ESRC at the time was Adair Turner, and he set up the committee, the Centre for Climate Change Economics and Policy, the CCCEP, which I think is a bit of a trolling joke against people who are sort of worried about climate communism. But anyway, he set up this research outfit to feed into the Climate Change Committee's analysis, which he went on to chair as well after he'd finished at the ESRC. So there was the intention is to like kind of to build all these academic institutions and to build this sort of research agenda, but I always wonder which way does it really flow? Because there's some other probably some mythology developing on our side of the debate as well. To what extent does sort of academic research flow freely into government thinking, and and to what, or certainly to Westminster thinking, and to what extent is the reverse true? Like the kind of the academia is responding to Westminster's needs and commands. Is that something you see much of?
So there's a very weird ecosystem going on, and I wouldn't necessarily say academia, though when academic studies are done, they usually absorb the literature, but think tanks based around Westminster and the energy department are caught in this kind of symbiosis where they just make up figures, and then their friends feed the made up figures into their own models. So there seems to be a bit of an issue in that a large chunk of think tanks around Westminster that do modeling on energy systems and stuff are sponsored by companies that produce renewable energy, and are clearly, if subconsciously, mindful of that. On top of that, their job's made quite easy by the fact that the energy department makes stuff up. Like their recent wind price projections, LCOE projections, were just made up. They clearly made them up.
We talked about those.
I mean, yeah. There's no, like, it's just like plain lying, and I would be really fascinated to know who is responsible for that, because there's no way you could do that without being self-aware about what you were doing. So, I mean, the department's been making stuff up for a while. It just became most egregious in the latest iteration. But that helps, because then you have this well-funded ecosystem of think tanks that want renewables to work, who can then take energy department projections and fit them into their bullshit models. Excuse my French, sorry.
That's fine.
And then throw them back at policymakers. So, kind of in answer to your question, there is a lot of I don't want to call it corruption, but kind of warped incentives in think tank world. But there is also definitely a flow of information coming out of government because of some kind of weird activism that's going on in government that really exacerbates the situation. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's good. Now, I'm afraid because I wasn't here. Ed, is there anything you want to wrap up with? While I get the closing noises ready.
Well, no, I just think, you know, just to thank James for the work, particularly the articles he's written, which kind of have started to really pull all this apart. So to thank you, James, for coming on the show, and to thank you for doing the work that you've been doing, and may it continue. And you know, I'm sure we'd love to have you on the show again, and we might do some podcasts in the future, or we might do a special where we get into more of the weeds on this. But once again, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And I'm sure Ben is about to announce that we'll go on to Twitter to discuss, as it says below, can popular opinion change climate politics? And without further ado, I think we'll draw things to a close, other than to ask people to visit our website, read the articles, read James at The Critic Mag. I would say at least half of his articles are about the energy problems that we have in this country, and how that's being driven by the green agenda. So
Great.
read up James's articles, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me. I'm very generous.